We still use this word today, liberalism, right? And in some quarters it's a dirty word. As a matter of fact, a lot of people who 2 generations ago would be perfectly happy to be discussed as political liberals now call themselves progressives because they want to dissociate themselves from some of the baggage of the term. It has a specific meaning in religion as well. And your book talks about it in terms of a few traits. So it talks about liberalism implying a concern with ethics rather than metaphysics. That may not be that easy to relate to, even though you've had your philosophical perspectives class, because what is metaphysics? Metaphysics is speculation or doctrines about what's ultimately real. And so liberals are more interested in, well, how do we fix society, or how do we take care of the neighbor, rather than worrying about abstruse theological points. There's a focus on this world rather than the supernatural. There is an impatience with rigid barriers separating groups of people, realms of thought, or categories of being. There's a tendency to sort of wear those down, to say those don't matter so much. There's a confidence in the powers of the individual to discern ultimate truth. So think about the Quakers and the natural light that we talked about last class session. That would be an example of this. Without reliance on revelation, tradition, or external authority, and a predisposition to see human nature is fundamentally good. Those are how liberalism tends to play out in terms of religion. And where do these ideas come from? I mean, somebody mentioned original sin earlier. If you really stress original sin, you're probably not going to be a liberal. Because original sin means we're all screwed up. We're all a bunch of screwed up people, just like a couple steps away from being terrible people. So that's very different than sort of broad sense that human beings are fundamentally good. You're all familiar with the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is a time that a lot of people who fit into this tradition look back to as a particularly good time, a time when things were on the rise. The Renaissance, the term means what? Something. Rebirth. Right, very good. Rebirth. And rebirth of what? What do you remember from your lit classes or history classes?
Culture, like in the arts.
Yeah, so we associate it with painting and sculpture, music to a certain degree. Now those are being driven by a rebirth in terms of thought. And they were going back to rebirth of ancient, pre-Christian thought, Greco-Roman thought. There's an increased emphasis on scholarship. They wanted to go back to what they thought were the pure sources of Western culture, like Plato, or not Aristotle. They didn't like him because the scholastics had used Aristotle. Epictetus, some of the people you may have studied in your philosophy classes. They also tended to be very, very critical of tradition. We often associate this with the humanism. Humanism versus tradition. To be a humanist meant to focus on human nature and what we could know about it and the human experience. It's very this worldly, isn't it? You know a number of different people who fit in with that. You think of, you mentioned the arts, so you think of Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci. Your book talks about Valla, who, by the way, we have a person who knows quite a bit about in the philosophy department, who's a specialist in Renaissance philosophy. And the Renaissance leads to rediscovery of a lot of culture that had been left behind. Not soon after the Renaissance, and really, in many respects, these go hand in hand, is the Reformation, right? And they're going to influence each other. And in the Reformation, you have people like Martin Luther, and John Calvin. John Calvin was extremely well educated. And you also have people like, your book mentions, Erasmus, who was a humanist. Erasmus was actually a guy who corresponded with Luther and tried to argue Luther out of his position. Erasmus remained a Catholic, but he was intensely critical of some of the things that were going on within the Catholic Church, almost as critical as Luther was. Now, why would he do that? Why didn't he just take a side and say, Luther, you've gone too far. Everything Catholic is a-okay. Whatever the Pope wants is what we need to do. Well, because he's devoted to these ideals. And so within the Catholic Church, there were critics as well. Another person who you know about, Galileo. What's he famous for? Besides being persecuted, that's one thing he's famous for. Proving Aristotle was wrong about some things, and endorsing the Copernican view of the cosmos. And then, of course, he gets put under house arrest. So he's sort of a patron saint of this entire movement. And there's a lot to be said on one side or another, about how much Galileo himself brought about that situation, but I'll skip over that. They talk about another guy, Francis Bacon, who writes you may know him from The Idols of the Cave. It was one of his main essays. But he writes a new logic to try to help think out all these sort of problems. It also talks about Servetus. Servetus is a particularly unfortunate guy. He's a free thinker, and he's being chased by the Catholic Inquisition. So where does a free thinker go to? Go to the Protestants. They burn him at the stake. So he literally goes out of the frying pan into the fire. But why is he burned at the stake? He's looked at as being a heretic. The Reformation didn't necessarily bring about increased freedom of thought. In Calvin's Geneva, you could get yourself in a lot of trouble. So this is what's going on for a while, and then something new comes about that has its roots in these, and you're probably well familiar with this as well. The Enlightenment. If you're thinking in religious terms, you may associate Enlightenment with Eastern religions, but there's actually a period of time that we call the Enlightenment, and it roughly, think about the 18th century primarily, although it's got 17th century roots. And during the Enlightenment, you have all these intellectuals. It's an intellectual and, to some degree, social and political movement. A lot of criticism of existing culture, authority, society, and the view that human beings, or human reason, can understand and solve all of our problems. For example, war, or famine, or disease, or unhappiness among human beings. The Enlightenment was a period of optimism where they thought, if you can just think things through, get rid of all the things that are keeping you from thinking it through, we could fix everything. Didn't turn out that way in a lot of cases. Think about the history of the French Revolution, which is very much a Enlightenment development. The revolution was good in part because it got rid of the king and a lot of the nobles, but how did it get rid of them? Anyone remember?
Beheading.
Eventually the guillotine. And then after you're done with the nobles, who gets guillotined? a lot of the very people who belonged to the revolution in the first place, and you have the terror, and pretty soon you have somebody like Napoleon coming about, and then you have decades of intense warfare taking place. The Enlightenment isn't always as, in its effect, is not always as good as its promise is. But in promise, the idea is if we could just get rid of these traditions, these things that are holding us back, we would be able to have a sort of new Eden, a new paradisical state on earth. We could reconcile human beings to each other. If you think about the French Revolution and its ideals, equality, right? Of all people, everyone should be equal. Sometimes religion would preach inequality, right? Freedom, liberté, fraternité, brotherhood, relatedness, everyone being, together. These are very high ideals, and they thought that traditional religion was interfering with that. So some of the Enlightenment thinkers that we could look at would be people like Isaac Newton and John Locke. Here in America, the ones that would be particularly important would be guys like Benjamin Franklin. You probably associate Benjamin Franklin with, the kite experiment and being kind of a fat guy, wearing a vest and maybe being a printer and, having the spectacles. But he was incredibly important, not only to the revolution, but to American ideas. He wrote an autobiography that, like your book points out, is really sort of a secular version of John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress, which was one of the best-selling books at that time. And Benjamin Franklin was a successful man. He was a self-made man, and he attributes his success to developing certain virtues. Where is he getting these virtues from? Jesus and Socrates. Try to imitate those two guys. Which more? Neither more. As a matter of fact, the Jesus guy only insofar as he is, showing you an ethical way of life. Then we have Thomas Jefferson. Another incredibly important figure. They're actually part of what's called the American Enlightenment. And what do you associate Jefferson with, historically?
Deism.
Yeah, very good. Deism, which we'll talk about in just a moment. What else? He's a president, so that gives you a lot of power. What else?
And you have a lot of slaves.
Yeah, he was kind of, all men are created equal thing. A little bit hypocritical on that, There are descendants, too, of Jefferson from some of those slaves. What else?
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, why?
John Locke's life, liberty, protection of property.
Yeah, Jefferson is influenced by Locke, and what document is this going into? What key document?
The Declaration.
The Declaration
of Independence.
Very good. So the Declaration of Independence, one of the founding documents of the United States, is penned by Jefferson. And you're right, he's drawing on Locke, he's changing things a bit. Property becomes the pursuit of happiness. The rhetoric that Jefferson uses is coming out of the Enlightenment, and it's incredibly influential. He's also one of the people who starts talking about the separation of church and state in his letter to the Danbury Baptists. The wall of separation between church and state, not in the Declaration, not in the Constitution. It's in a document that Jefferson wrote as a letter, but it becomes part of our national consciousness. Jefferson is, like you pointed out, a deist. And deism is this notion that God is a creator, but a lot of the things that the religious people are teaching about God are just dead wrong. God starts the world, and you can tell that God started the world because he implanted the moral law in human beings, and he implanted order in things, order and structure. Then it's hands off. He doesn't do miracles. He not only doesn't work on Sundays, he doesn't work on any day. He's done all the work that he's going to do. And the goal then is for human beings to orient themselves properly to God through the use of reason, not through religion, through reason alone. Thomas Paine, by the way, another important American deist and Enlightenment figure, writes a book called The Age of Reason, which is explicitly giving an argument in favor of deism along the lines of Jefferson. Jefferson, like your book points out, came up with his own version of the Gospels, where he literally cut out every passage where some miracle took place, because the view was God doesn't mess around with the laws of nature. He doesn't do that sort of thing. So it's a very short book, because if you read the Gospels, there's an awful lot of miracles taking place, isn't there? The changing the water into wine, healing people, the loaves into fishes. If you were to do that, what would be left of the Gospels? What pieces of it would you have? Maybe the travel log. Jesus went here, and then he went there, went up in the mountains, went in the desert, got on a boat. What else? That's not very interesting. Nobody cares where he went just for its own sake. What else would you have? Take all the miracles out, all the supernatural occurrences. What would be left in the story that Jefferson would care about? Yeah.
Parables.
Yeah. Now, why would those still be there? What's the importance of the parables?
They outline some sort of basic moral value, each one.
Yes, that's exactly right. They set out a way of living and an ordering of values. Along with that would go some of the other sayings. Like on the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, blessed are those who do this. That's saying you should live this way. It's setting out a kind of ethics. So the Jefferson Bible reduces religion to ethics. It tries to get rid of anything supernatural. Now, how influential was this? That's a good question to ask. How much did this catch on? Was this always kind of an elite movement? The answer to that is yes. It never became a truly popular movement. Your book talks about religious people having to accommodate themselves to this to some degree, and oftentimes they did it through hybrids, sort of bringing together Enlightenment thought, but also more traditional religious thought. And one way in which this happened was through what they're calling the Scottish common sense philosophy, which we actually don't teach much in intro to philosophy classes anymore. It doesn't have much influence, but it had a lot of influence on early American thought, in part because there's the ethics thing coming in. They taught not only that we learn things by experience, by reasoning, but also by sort of an innate sense for what's right and wrong. We have a sense for the moral that allows us to make responsible choices. The book also mentions one other thing, which is another ism, which is worth pointing out, because it's going to turn up again later on. Universalism. And they don't exist anymore.